I want to situate Jimmy in the context of his life as a person, a father, a husband, a Catholic, a democracy activist, and a man who really, I think, exemplifies what freedom means to Hong Kongers. I've known Jimmy for about 30 years or so. I met him in 1993 when he was just getting into the media business. Resolution commemorating, celebrating Jimmy Lai Day, Freedom Day, is December 8th, which is when he celebrates his birthday. He doesn't actually know when he was born and even what year. The documents say 1947. I've seen British passports which have different dates on them, and so it's not really clear. But what is clear is that he was born just before the Maoist revolution, the Communist revolution, in 1947 or 48 in southern China on the outskirts of Guangzhou, what was called Canton long ago. That's his mother, that's Jimmy on the right. And in the center is his twin sister, CY. There's an older sister, Huan Ying, who's on the left. The family was ripped apart by the trauma of the Chinese Revolution. It had been a wealthy ship-owning family. His mother was wife number 2 in that family. The first wife had already died by the time Jimmy was born. Shortly after the communists took over, his parents got permission to go to Hong Kong, but only if they left their children behind. And so his mother said, I can't do that. I'll stay with the kids. The father left. That split the family apart. The house was split into different apartment units. And so they went from a situation of relative affluence and a family that had been very supportive of the communist guerrillas, the Japanese occupation, and even afterwards. It was a pro-CCP family, but they soon met the reality of CCP rule. His mother was sent to what Jimmy always described as labor camps. They weren't technically, I think, what most China experts would call labor camps, because she was able to come in and out, come home on weekends, but she left these little kids. Jimmy was about 4, Jimmy and CY were about 4, Huan Ying was 6. They were pretty much left to fend for themselves, and neighbors helped out, and the mom would come home on the weekends, try to bring a little food. She was a great cook, but she apparently would deliberately burn rice and then be able to bring home the burned rice. I mean, that was life, right? And she was made to kneel on glass and wear a dunce's cap and do all those nice things that the Chinese do to their enemies. Yeah, obviously a very, very tough childhood. Jimmy had to repeat a couple of grades. He never even graduated from elementary school, as far as we can tell. Yeah, this is Jimmy at the age of, I think, 11, might have been 12, shortly before he left for Hong Kong. So think about it, his mother gives him permission to make the dangerous journey to Hong Kong. And it took me a while when I was writing the book, because I've known Jimmy, as I said, for 3 decades, but I wasn't interviewing him to do a biography. And by the time I wanted to do a biography, he was in prison and unavailable to me. I was like, why would a mom let their son make a journey like this? And then it kind of hit me, and I wondered why I was so stupid. This was during the famine in China. So this is a time when 45 million people perhaps died of hunger in the greatest man-made famine in history. And so I think his mother decided that the best chance Jimmy had for living was to try to make it to Hong Kong. His sister, CY, swam to Hong Kong 4 years later. So Jimmy went when he was 12 and a half, and this was pretty much the environment in Hong Kong then, so it wasn't paradise. There were about 1.5 million other people like him who had fled China since 1949. It's a city of 3 million people, half of them were refugees, incredible number of people sleeping on the streets and in shanty towns like this. Jimmy first looked up his mother's sister, his aunt, and she was living with her husband in a place not dissimilar to this. It was so small that there wasn't room for him to sleep on the floor. So they found him a job at a factory. I mean, that very first night he slept on the factory floor. He went from being a child laborer, sleeping on a factory floor, to 15 years later owning a factory, which pretty quickly became the largest sweater maker in Hong Kong, if not in Asia, and became a millionaire, wildly successful. He got bored with that and decided to start, rather than just making clothes, he'd start selling them. So here he is in the late 1980s at Giordano, which is the retail chain that I'm sure many of you have bought shirts from. We could go into how he revolutionized fast fashion, and I mean, this guy, again, I've known Jimmy for 30 years. It wasn't until I was writing this book that I realized what an incredible entrepreneur he was. I thought he was one of thousands of entrepreneurs like him in Hong Kong. He was probably one of 10. I mean, he was brilliant beyond belief as a businessman. I go into this in some detail in the book, but I won't bore this audience with it now, but feel free to ask me about it. I'm just really in awe of him as a businessman. He was pretty apolitical, but he was very interested in the changes, the economic reforms of the Deng Xiaoping era of the 1980s. And when this is a picture from 1989, spring of 1989, Tiananmen Square. You have three of the most prominent student leaders, Chai Ling on the left, Wu Kai-shi in the center, and Wang Dan on the right. And Jimmy made T-shirts with three different styles of T-shirts, one with each of their images, their names on them, silk screened on, and sold them. Raised money, sent over $100,000 up to China to support the students. And I talked to all of them for the book. And actually two of them are either on our board or our advisory board. Jimmy really picked out the right people. He picked out the leaders, and obviously was heartbroken. I mean, devastated after the June 4th killings. This, of course, you all know this tank man picture. It later hit me that Jimmy is kind of like the tank man right now. If you think of him, it's like Xi Jinping and the CCP are rolling through, and Jimmy's standing up. So Francis and I will talk more about this later. So Jimmy decides he's bored with the garment business. He's bored with just making sweaters. He's bored with selling shirts, and he had a number of other ideas. The most prominent was to set up a Chinese fast food kind of chain, like a Chipotle style chain. But then events intervene, the Tiananmen killings. He decides media and the transparency that media brings, and the freedom to uncover government wrongdoing is going to be the way forward for China. It's going to push the economic reforms forward, push the social reforms forward, and knowing nothing about media, but having the incredible self-confidence that he has, he says, okay, I'm going to start a magazine. And that went well. When I first met him, he was making plans to start a newspaper, and that was, of course, Apple Daily, which he started in 1995. 2 years before Chris Patten, last governor of Hong Kong, left, 2 years before the handover. This doesn't look like anything special today, but at that time, all Hong Kong newspapers were in black and white. They didn't have a lot of pictures. They had really boring headlines, and Jimmy bought state-of-the-art, some of the best printing presses in the world, full color throughout. Big photos, big headlines, and amazing editorial that was everything from paparazzi chasing stars and starlets to Nobel Prize winning economists writing on the economy to stock market tips to horse racing. He had everything, and he had a great investigative team. That is, of course, the 1997 handover that marked the beginning of a new era in Hong Kong after 156 years of British colonialism. And you think of the bravery of Jimmy launching a newspaper. It's cost him hundreds of millions of dollars 2 years before the communists, who he knew very well, were going to take over. And I remember being at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in June 1997, a couple of weeks before this, and Jimmy was on stage with the founder of USA Today, Al Newharth. And he broke down and started crying. He said he expected to go to jail. And we're all pretty optimistic then, and I think in the wake of the changes in Korea and Taiwan, the kind of democratization, the end of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, it's like, yeah, we knew the communists were bad, and of course we'd seen Tiananmen, but somehow we wanted to believe that it was going to be different. And I think Jimmy wanted to believe that too, but it wasn't to be. Apple Daily and the magazine that he started first, Next magazine, quickly became the focus of the opposition in Hong Kong. This is 2003, the first time the government tried to push through a national security law, and the photoshopped face with the cream puff going into it is the then head of Hong Kong, Tung Chee-hwa. And that is a Next magazine that's repurposed into a sign. So Next and Apple took when the consultation started for this national security law, there were 15 or 20 people, burning a copy of it. 8 months later, there were 500,000 people out on the streets of Hong Kong, and I think nobody had more to do with it than the folks at Apple and Next. This is another picture from that day. It was not surprisingly the largest demonstration in Hong Kong history, except for maybe one supporting demo during the Tiananmen period. Certainly the largest since the Chinese had taken over. And you just look at how peaceful, how friendly, just what an incredible crowd it was of people from, a few months old to, almost 100 years old. I mean, it's just one of the most friendliest, open, warmest crowds you can imagine. So we're going to fast forward quite a bit. This is 2014. This is the beginning of the umbrella movement when I think it was 87 rounds of tear gas were fired on a Sunday evening. And Jimmy had actually stepped back from politics, and it's important to remember that Jimmy never aspired to be a political leader. He never wanted to be Hong Kong's Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King or Lech Walesa. He was above all, he's like a businessman, he's a media guy, he's just a guy that believes in freedom. I mean, he's kind of an ordinary Hong Konger. He wasn't a member of fancy clubs and didn't hang out with the hoi polloi and the elite, but he wanted to show his sympathy with the students, and I believe this is probably the first time he got tear gas. This is, many of you of course will know about the umbrella movement. I think that's when Francis, maybe you can talk a little bit more about it, but that's when you got your start with an occupation of downtown Hong Kong and 2 other locations in Hong Kong for 79 days. Many people, of course, lived and camped out there. Jimmy had a tent there, and he was there every single day, but he did go home to sleep, I have to. Anybody could come up and bother him, and one group of pro-Beijing guys did that, and they dumped raw pig guts all over him. I mean, he's a guy who is, we can talk about this separately, but he suffered he suffered a murder plot, people trying to ram cars into his gate, Molotov cocktails. I mean, he's really gone through a lot, physically suffered a lot. Do you want to add anything about the umbrella movement?
So I was 15 years old at that time, and that was like the start of my activism, as a high school student. And obviously this movement was led by students. There were, started with like university students. They were boycotting classes to express their view about, a government proposal. And then Joshua Wong and many other like secondary school students also led another class boycott, and it was on that night the protester decided to storm into the government's headquarters, and that's how the umbrella movement first started. And I think the previous photo of Jimmy being tear gas was the beginning, the first day of umbrella movement, and it motivated like so many people to get out of their shell and join the protest, because they saw how students who were unarmed, innocent, and trying to voice their opinion were faced with tear gas and just a lot of excessive police force. And I think that's also kind of what motivated the 2019 movement as well. At the beginning, I think at the very beginning of the movements, people came out because they have opinions, a position about the proposal from the government. But after that, because of the excessive police force, it motivated even more people to come out because they think that this is not right. I think this is like very straightforward cause. It's like this is not right to treat people like that when you need to listen to people's voice, and obviously the Hong Kong government wasn't ready for it, or they think it's going too far. So that's, yeah. That was kind of like the beginning of my activism. And I might just add a little bit of it. Like, I think after like 3 days when the movement started, the leaders decided that we need to occupy the streets. And so there you have like so many tents on this highway, like the main highway of Hong Kong. And then people just camped out for like 79 days, and there were students going on like hunger strike. There were actually like zones that the volunteers created for students to study, and I was one of them. I went through so many tests and study period like sessions on the highway. It was really like a new neighborhood set up on the highway. So I remember when it was clear out, for me it was like a great loss. It feels like my city was like dismantled, really.
So this is, thanks Francis, and I think maybe we get back and talk a little bit more about this new sense of a Hong Kong identity and a new generation. And this was a city where I was told when I moved there that by a lot of tycoons and in particular that Hong Kong people didn't care about politics, which is stupid, of course. 500,000 or so had come out in support of Tiananmen protesters, but after 2003, but above all after 2014. And I think in 2014 we saw this generation of people. You were born after the handover. You weren't there when the British were there. You were supposed to be free of colonial influences, and yet you guys were the ones that were leading the movement.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Hong Kongers, the identity, is that we have never experienced a time that we are able to, determine our future. It was like the British colony first, and then later on it was handed over to China, which is, some people would say it's another colonizer. So we never have our own say, even during the handover when the decision was made. Like, it was not, like, I think Hong Kongers' voice were not involved. And so it was always like up to someone to decide for us. And that's why people are so eager to have democracy. And that was promised in the basic law, that eventually Hong Kong people would have the rights to elect their own officials, their own chief executive through universal suffrage. But I think, the concepts of Hong Kongers' identity differ by generations. Like for me, I was born after the handover, and I've never experienced a colonization by Britain. And so like I grew up in that Beijing rule Hong Kong, and so there are like some Beijing influence, but then still at that time it was kind of like the golden period of Hong Kong. Like I can still enjoy certain degree of freedom. I can still see like protests and marches like every July, like 1st of July, or like whenever there's like debates happening, like you can see that on the streets really. Like Hong Kongers have this identity of like, I have the right to speak freely and say something about certain things if I don't like it. And it kind of runs in our blood, I think.
I think it's really important to underscore that Britain had an agreement with China, signed a British Joint Declaration, supplemented by the Basic Law of 1990, which was kind of a mini constitution, and they promised that Hong Kong would be even freer than it had been under Britain. And China had this propaganda that you'll be masters of your own house, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, one country, two systems. All these promises that you guys grew up, that we were all told about, and that there would be a path towards universal suffrage. Because Hong Kong was a free society, but not a democratic one. Hong Kong people couldn't freely elect the legislative council, which is like the city council, let alone the chief executive, their mayor. We kept hearing that democracy was just around the corner. In 1997, there were going to be free elections in 2007. Well, this just kept getting pushed back, and I think people got very frustrated.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned before, like in 1991, Hong Kong has like the first election under British rule. 6 out of 10 Hong Kongers actually choose pro-democracy candidate, and which shows that Hong Kong people really want democracy, and it has always been like that even through the last democratic election we have, which is in 2020. The pro-democracy camp completely, like it has a landslide victory, and which again shows that Hong Kong people wants democracy. They respect freedom and human rights, and that's have always been what we wanted. But that certain voice is not being heard, it's not being responded by the government, and instead it's responded by a huge crackdown from Beijing because they think that it's gone too far, I think, at that point.
Yeah. And so, it's just so interesting that you work closely with Joshua Wong. He was born in, I think, October 1996. He was less than a year old when the British left. So many of you hadn't even been born yet. But you had been brought up with the idea that Hong Kong was a free place. And now China was changing the goalposts and making it a less free place. And so we saw the tear gas that first night. It was I think Joshua went over the barriers on the Friday night, and this was Sunday night by then. And crowds had spilled into the streets, and police fired something like 87 rounds of tear gas, which at the time people were like, this is unbelievable. There's never been this much tear gas in Hong Kong. I think the Korean farmers, when they had the WTO meeting, got a lot of tear gas lobbed at them, but not at Hong Kong people, and this upset people. By 2019, they were firing 87 rounds of tear gas a minute, I think. I mean, it was just an unbelievable escalation in-state violence. So this next shot that you've seen for a while is Jimmy Lai getting arrested in mid-December at the end of that 79 days. And I think it was the first time he was arrested, in fact. Yeah, it was civil disobedience charge. I mean, arrested for refusing to leave. As I said at the beginning, I just really want people to remember Jimmy Lai's in prison. He's a symbol of resistance. He's a remarkable man, but he's a father, he's a husband, and he's a human being. So we can't just think of him as an abstract person up on a pedestal. So this was a trip we were on in May 2017 in New Orleans. That's his wife, Teresa, his second wife, who's just a rock of stability and support for him. That was 2017. Now we fast forwarded to 2019, and the crowds were even bigger, and there were as many as 2 million people out in the streets some days for a period of months. It was different. There wasn't an Occupy situation, but the protests went on from, well, the June 4th commemoration was very large that year, about 160,000 people. And then June 9th, a series of demonstrations started. The first one, I think, had 1 million people. I mean, by far the biggest in Hong Kong history, but some of them there were 1.7 million people, 2 million people. I mean, who knows? This is a city of 7 million people. Unlike Washington, D.C., where people can come down from New York or Michigan or wherever, people were not coming across the border in any significant numbers from the mainland to attend this. So a city of 7.5 million people, 2 million people or so coming. I mean, it's a pretty resounding referendum on the government performance. Yeah, I just have a bunch of just shots that aren't Jimmy, but are trying to give a sense of that spirit of 2019. As Francis said, the first elections under the British, well, ever in Hong Kong, were the first territory-wide elections for the city council, really for anything territory-wide, were in 1991, and very heavy turnout. Really surprised everybody, except maybe the people, that the pro-democracy camp got about 60% of the vote, and it's just shocking. And all the way through, Hong Kong pretty much was 6 out of 10 people would vote for the pro-democracy camp. And the system was rigged. There wasn't any chance of the opposition actually taking political power and actually carrying into effect the promises for universal suffrage. So what you had was the street. And this was just a night in, I think it was August, it might have been September, downtown Hong Kong. You just jump in if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and if you look at the picture in the middle of it, there's like a yellow umbrella. It's a symbolism of the umbrella from the umbrella movement, where you see yellow umbrellas on the highway, and that particular umbrella is actually from Apple Daily.
Right.
And I remember at that time, there would be people who in Hong Kong they would get these umbrella and then send it to overseas so we can have it. At that time, I was in the U.S. already. I was studying in the U.S. For journalism, and so I was leading the international coordination of the rallies abroad. And so I remember there were people who sent these umbrellas to us, to Hong Kongers in different cities, so we can have that in our rallies, in San Francisco and New York and DC and all that. And so this is an incredible crowd, but it's just one of the demonstration. There was were tons of demonstration locally in Hong Kong and abroad. It was a very creative movement. I think there were Lenin walls, people put up posted messages on the walls to talk about their vision of democratic Hong Kong,
that's one
that.
There, yeah.
It's everywhere in Hong Kong at that time.
These were all over the city, and yeah, they were named after, I guess, I don't know
John Lennon.
Yeah, but there was a wall in Prague, I guess.
And there are a lot of different creative methods that people try to, they use their own expertise to contribute in the movement. And so there was the notion from the government that Jimmy is the instigator of this whole movement. It doesn't make sense, because when you were participating in the movement, you would know that everything was self-motivated. People really jump in with their own expertise. If you're a designer, you create graphics to promote about the next demonstration. If you are a data and a software engineer or a IT person, you would create apps to show people where the protests are happening. People are jumping, people from all walks of lives, no matter what occupation, they find a way to contribute. And it's not just Jimmy Lai, one man, are able to motivate, mobilized all those people, but that's the crime that he was being charged for.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that, I think, a bit later on, because I know some of you want to hear about what's going on now, and many of you are roughly familiar with the Jimmy story. But I do think it's ironic that this, pretty mild-mannered, actually quite shy man, who, wasn't even like a leader in any real sense, is somehow being seen as the Black Hand who's just, somehow manipulating millions of Hong Kongers. But I'm sorry to say, it's just how the Chinese Communist Party thinks the world works, because that's how they organize things. And that's Jimmy on August 18th, 2019. He later he was convicted for leading an unauthorized march that day, even though the rally itself in Victoria Park had been legal, but he was convicted for that. I think it's just an incredible thing. This is just a lunchtime scene in a shopping mall in Hong Kong where there was a pop-up rally, and it lasted less than an hour for some people to get back to work, being good Hong Kongers, and it was built around the Five Demand movement, which was to withdraw the extradition treaty,
Set up an independent commission to investigate the police brutality and things like that.
Yeah.
Or ultimately, is universal suffrage.
And universal suffrage, yeah. This was August 10th, 2020. Jimmy had been arrested before, as I said, but as you saw, there was, at least in that 2014 photo, he was accorded a lot of respect. This was ritual humiliation. It was actually during COVID, there were social distancing rules, and yet the cops were manhandling him. Obviously, he's not a risk in any sense, and yet they handcuffed him to humiliate him. This was Apple Daily that day. There were about 200, and I don't know if I mentioned, I was on the board of directors, and there were 250 cops who came in to check out the scene of the crime, take away a lot of evidence. Perp walked this major Black Hand perpetrator, Jimmy Lai, through the newsroom. Staff was incredible, and at its peak, Apple and Next, is called Next Digital, employed about 4,000 people, about half of whom were in Hong Kong and half of whom were in Taiwan, and that was another part of the operation. Yeah, I interviewed a lot of them for my book. Just really incredible people, and their loss, many of them have had to leave journalism after the shuttering of Apple Daily, and the loss is a real loss for Hong Kong. This is when Jimmy got out of prison, a little less than before the statutory 48 hours they could hold him was up. This, unfortunately, is later that year. This is December, so they took him back. Do you want to add something?
I think, he got bail out, and then 2 weeks later, it was already a huge bail amount, and then 2 weeks later, he was arrested again. Yeah. And that was the last time that... Yeah.
So the first shots were from August. This is December, I think December 3rd or 4th. They revoked his bail, put him in prison. He got out. He got bailed out for Christmas. He's out for 3 or 4 days, and then so I think this is before Christmas. And you just see he's this guy. It's he looks kind of bewildered. You see the chains on him, which is often how they move him around. Again, he's a guy in his 70s who had a chance to leave Hong Kong, who didn't leave. He was ready to stay and fight for his principles. But again, there's this sense of ritual humiliation.
And remember that Jimmy Lai, I think, in my impression, he has always advocated for nonviolence advocacy, and yet he's being chained up like he's a terrorist, and I think that's a really important context to add here. Yeah,
I don't want to speak for Frances, but many people in her generation felt that he was far too moderate, and in fact, when he went on stage the first night it was kind of that Saturday night of what became the Umbrella Movement, he and others were booed because the students felt that they had been too moderate. And I think Jimmy was willing to step back and let the students take the lead, and I think that's in fact what he was doing by bearing witness and showing solidarity with the tent, but he wasn't getting up there on stage and taking a leadership role. But yeah, he was nonviolent, and so it's ironic that he's being treated like this. Even though they threw him in jail, the paper kept going. We were doing fine as a director. In fact, until 2019 came, we were more focused on making the transition from the paper edition to a digital edition, and people said that Hong Kongers wouldn't pay for news online. In fact, we had 600,000 paying subscribers when we were shut down, and the banks were told they couldn't process our credit card payments anymore. We couldn't pay our staff. We couldn't tap the bank funds. If any banker helped us pay our electricity bill, that she or he could get 7 years in prison. So not a sustainable position, so we had to shut down at the end of June 24th, 2021. This is a picture outside the Apple headquarters of the final edition. And this is the last known picture of Jimmy. It was taken with a long lens camera on a hill above Stanley Prison, which many of you might know in the southern part of Hong Kong Island. It's the oldest and I guess largest maximum security prison in Hong Kong. Jimmy has been in solitary confinement. I mean, you heard during the introduction, yesterday marked 1,800 days of captivity. That doesn't count those first weeks before Christmas. It's since December 31st, 2020. So you think 1,800 days, you're in an area that's, kind of this size. And you get an hour a day to exercise outside. So he's going out for his hour a day of exercise. Just a little bit, we can talk a little bit about the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. We do research. Francis has just worked on some incredible groundbreaking study on prison conditions in Hong Kong. It included interviewing 17 former political prisoners. So we've done a lot of research on how Hong Kong has emerged as the worst place in the world for smuggling technology that the Russians use for their war machine. We've looked so far at the US and Canada, material that's made here that's going into Iranian drones used to kill Ukrainians, going into Russian missiles and other equipment. So we do research. We're Francis is here in DC. We've got my colleague Shannon Van Sant as well, and John Stivers, who runs the office. We're very engaged with the government and with Congress, but we also like to make noise. So we're involved in media, and from time to time we do these large-scale wall projections. This one was on the Guggenheim Museum in New York. I kind of like to think that's fitting, it's kind of artistic, but we did not ask permission first. And this one I love too, it's Tower Bridge in London. It was right before the Beijing Olympics. Kind of hopeful, I mean, we didn't think that late, but when we started this out, we thought with the Beijing Olympics coming up that surely Beijing would not want the embarrassment of having political prisoners in a place like Hong Kong that aspires to be a global financial center. We were wrong. To remind you, so that's Teresa, that's his daughter Claire, who's in DC and just gave a very powerful interview on Monday, and that's their son Augustin. I don't think we have any pictures of Sebastian. Sebastian's his oldest son with Teresa, and he's been an incredibly powerful advocate on his father's part. Just wanted to finish with one final shot of Jimmy, who's a painter of some repute. That is not his painting, that's by Wallace Ting, but it was a good friend of Jimmy and Teresa's. Jimmy actually, much to my surprise, I found out he'd taken a few months off in the mid-1990s. I kind of thought he was running a few businesses, but he'd gone off to Amsterdam to hang out with Wallace Ting and study with him for 3 months. So we can talk more about his time in prison, but he spends a lot of time in prison drawing, and mostly religious themes, although I think he's trying to take a little more of a Wallace Ting approach now. Francis, maybe you want to add some other things?
Jimmy's story, it's very inspiring. I think when I was young, like you said, I don't see him as like the model or like activist, because he has never been like the most out there kind of activist. Like it was the student leaders for my generation, just like Nathan Law or like Joshua Wong, all these people. But I think like knowing about Jimmy's story, it's seeing how his fate kind of like intersects with Hong Kong's fate. And like you mentioned many times, like he had a choice to leave Hong Kong many occasions. Like he has homes like everywhere around the world, and he could have chosen to leave any time before he was arrested, but he chose to stay. And the reason why he chose to stay is because he thinks that he owes Hong Kong's freedom. He owes Hong Kong freedom. He thinks Hong Kong gives him the freedom when he was young, when he was little and poor. And so now it's time for him to give it back. I mean, like for me, I make the decision to leave Hong Kong at that time. I have the opportunity to leave Hong Kong, and I did, and that's why I'm sitting here. He has the courage that I can't, I don't have, and that's something I really admire him about, and especially since now he's the kind of a signature of like the symbol of religious freedom, press freedom, and he is now the oldest political prisoner in Hong Kong. I think we should, do as much as we can to get him out, and I really hope that governments, would also be as loud as possible. I mean, Claire gave that interview early this week and about Jimmy's latest status. Because I think she has the most updated status. She was in Hong Kong for a long time and visited her dad. And what she described was very bad. He's now 78 years old. And she talked about him, the nails and teeth are getting a grayish purple. He has muscle pain and muscle infection, which makes him painful that sometimes he couldn't even stand up. For him, no matter what the verdict and the sentence, the length of the sentence is it's pretty much life sentencing for him. At this age. It's heartbreaking. Even for myself, again, he was not the role model when I grew up as an activist. He has known his way all throughout, he knew what he was doing, and he has always chosen freedom every step of the way. He chose to run Apple Daily instead of Giordano. He has chosen to stay in Hong Kong and continue to run Apple Daily, continue to give truth and news to the Hong Kong people. And he has proven that information and transparency is so important, especially with the fire that happened in Hong Kong recently, that we saw that accountability and transparency is very important, which Hong Kong obviously now have lost that realm of accountability or whatnot.
Just remind people that Jimmy had a tough life. You saw he came, he was a child laborer, he slept in the factory floor. He lost a lot of his hearing in his right ear, I believe, as a result of, working in noisy conditions for so many years. He lost part of his fingertip in a machine, in an industrial accident. Before going into prison, he's been a diabetic for many years. So these are all pre-existing conditions. Since he's gone to prison, we know that he's suffered from COVID, which is kind of strange considering he's been in solitary confinement most of the time, but that's what we hear. I think has heart issues that came out in the waning days of the trial, which finished in late August. He had cataract surgery while he was in prison and seems to be having difficulty seeing the computer screen during the court trial. And yet he's a man that never wants to complain. I asked, supposedly according to the government, he's requested to be put in solitary confinement. Now, I don't know what he signed at what point. I honestly have no idea. People close to him say he never signed anything, but even if he did, okay, maybe you signed something 3 years ago, you wanted some privacy or your own space during COVID. Again, I have no idea what happened, but you'd think he might ask, well, can I get out? But the word come back to me is Jimmy is not going to ask for anything. He's not going to complain. He's not going to beg for anything. And he's just going to keep going. And if he dies in prison, he dies in prison. That's what none of us want. But unfortunately, he's a very stubborn guy, and these are his words, troublemaker. That's how he described himself to me when I once asked him why he did this. So, it's an increasingly worrisome situation. Anybody in their late 70s is aging, is going to have health problems. But from Francis's report on prison conditions, which I highly recommend you guys download from our website, we've just seen, the medical care is appalling in prisons. And the diet is bad. The medical care is worse, and there are petty punitive punishments relating to food and other issues that I think mean that we're in a very dangerous period. None of us know, is he a day or 10 years from dying? I don't know, but I know that he's approaching the end of his life, and if he's not let out soon, he's going to die in prison.
From my understanding, I think diabetes is the main cause of death in Hong Kong's prison.
Yeah.
That's caused by their diet, and so Jimmy is diabetic as well, and his health is really failing, and we continue, obviously CFHK continue to raise his profile and the profiles of other political prisoners, but obviously Jimmy is the oldest political prisoner right now, and we wanted to try our best to get him out.
I do want to say, though, I think Jimmy, I'd be remiss, and Jimmy wouldn't be happy if I just made it sound like he was a victim. First of all, he's knowingly, I want to say he's embraced his fate. He doesn't want to be in prison. He wants to be out. He's a British citizen. He wants to leave the country and be able to enjoy and relax the rest of his life in freedom. But he is living as a free man in prison. I had an incredible conversation with him. Besides, it didn't really have anything to do with being on the board of directors, but he asked me to moderate, co-host these Facebook live streams that he had in the second half of, till he went into prison, the second half of 2020, from when the national security law came in at the end of June until he was arrested. We had some great people. We had Cardinal Zen, we had Chris Patton. We just had very interesting people. But to me, the most memorable interview was one that he did with Nathan Sharansky, who was a Soviet refusenik who was 9 years in the Gulag. Very, very brave man. And actually, I didn't really do anything because it was just Jimmy peppering Nathan with questions. Basically, and I talked to Nathan later about it, he said, I've never met anybody like this. He knew he was going to prison. They talked a couple times besides the public event, the live stream event. He knew he was going to prison, and he wanted to be the best political prisoner he could be. So what does he do? He asks the best guy, guy who's been in for 9 years. And Sharansky said, when I went in, I knew that it wasn't up to me. It was up to the KGB, up to my captors, as to when I would be physically free. But I could live as a free man, and that's what I did. And that's from what I hear, and I was able to get a lot of the prison letters the first couple of years Jimmy was in. He's living as a free man. And in his head, with his art, with his prayer, with his reading. And he may die, but he'll die free, even if he's in chains in prison.
Congrats also to Chairman Molinar and the Select Committee in China for the resolution. What do you anticipate to be the impact of the resolution, and what the Select Committee could do to help Jimmy?
Resolution, obviously we're very happy that it was introduced as bipartisan support and again supported by Republican and Democratic members of Congress and in the House, and we've worked with them very closely on that. The first line of it, obviously, is about designating December 8th this year as Jimmy Lai Day, but I think the most important part, which we really want to get, is for them to call for immediate release of Jimmy Lai and other political prisoners. We always try to make sure, obviously Jimmy Lai has his name, but there are hundreds of political prisoners still languishing in Hong Kong prison, and we want to make sure that they also are they get the spotlight. And so this is not just about Jimmy; it's about all other political prisoners that are currently still behind bars for advocating for their pro-democracy values. I think what's important also I wanted to highlight in that resolution is that the resolution state that the Hong Kong government have failed to deliver their promise to provide universal suffrage to Hong Kongers, and I think that's very important to get U.S. Congress to say that, and also they are recognizing that there have been systematic abuse and political control going on in Hong Kong prison, which also resemble what we have been talking about in the recent report, which is the treatment of political prisoners in Hong Kong. So getting that resolution passed would be a very important stance that we can get from the U.S. Congress to at least have taking that statement out there and again calling for immediate release of the political prisoners. Well, we have worked very closely with the Select Committee on CCP. They have been really great since they have established, and I know some of the people in the audience, they in their own community, they have also engaged with the Select Committee. So it has been a really good relationship, and we also work with the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Both of them are really hardworking and pay a lot of attention on our issue, and they've been really great. And and I think even though they don't have legislative power, but we continue to engage with individual members on that commission, getting them educated on Chinese related issues, which really help our cause as well, to continue to get Hong Kong on the focus. And I know that commission also pay a lot of attention on Taiwan, Uyghur and Tibetan issues, and that's also the movement. I think we always try to collaborate with other community that are being affected or oppressed by the CCP. So it was a really helpful platform for us to do that.
If I could just add, I think the resolution helps ensure that Hong Kong isn't forgotten. If it's been pushed off the center stage by places like Ukraine, and Gaza, we understand that. But Hong Kong really matters beyond just the 7.5 million people in Hong Kong. It was on the front lines of freedom. It was one of the freest places in Asia, if not in the world, and yet in a matter of months, we saw, I'd say, the most dramatic, sweeping, thoroughgoing destruction of freedom that we've seen in modern times, absent a war. You know, you go overnight from a place where it's got a dynamic free press to a place where it's a business city, and yet one of the greatest entrepreneurs this city has ever produced is being paraded around in chains and shackles. And I think it beyond that, it shows clearly China can't be trusted. Of course, the one country, two systems formula was originally developed by Deng Xiaoping for Taiwan. And they still try to roll that out sometimes for Taiwan. Well, who's going to believe that? I think we can see, and I think there are enough people who are skeptical in Taiwan, but around the world, I think people can see that China's promises are worth nothing. They had the Sino-British Joint Declaration, they had the Basic Law, these things have all been destroyed. They told Hong Kong people they would be, as I said before, masters in their own house, they'd be freer than they were under the British period. Look where they are. Hundreds of political prisoners, and I mean, we haven't gotten to the fire yet. First of all, I've written this, it was in the Japan Times, but I want to be really emphatic about this. This fire would not have happened if Apple Daily existed. It just wouldn't have. You look at how many residents were trying to surface complaints. They knew there were problems there. If Apple had been around, there would have been dozens of reporters and photographers on this, and the other newspapers would have been reporting it. It just wouldn't have happened. So you see here, people sometimes think the free press is a luxury. It's not. It saves lives. It was Next magazine that broke the story of SARS back when the Chinese and Hong Kong governments were trying to cover it up. 299 people died in 2003 from SARS in Hong Kong. I'm sure the death toll would have been much, much, much higher absent the reporting. So let's get away with this myth that the free press is some kind of a luxury. It's not. And Apple was really core to what made Hong Kong so great, and China's destruction of Hong Kong shows the Chinese Communist Party's true character.
What made you decide to go on like this route? And so right now with uncertainty ahead, like how do you like reconcile internally? And, yeah.
For people who might not know, I started my activism since I was like 14 and 15 years old. It was originally like with the 2012 when Joshua Wong and a lot of other like high school students came out and against an education proposal from the government to impose like brainwashing national education. That was like the moment, I think I was like 13 years old, and at that time I realized that there's something wrong about like this place, like it's changing and it's not the same as like what I learned on textbook, and so that's how I started paying attention to what's going on, in society. And 2014 umbrella movement was the moment that really drew me into like social movements, and joined Scholarism, which is the organization that Joshua Wong started. And then I came to the States to study for journalism. Never thought that I would stay here for good, but I continue to, in the 2019 movement, I rally for support here in the US for the movement. And then eventually, like, I went back to Hong Kong for a bit, graduated from college and thought that I would stay there, but then the national security law was passed, and I was told that I'll be arrested if I continue to stay. And I remember I got a very trustworthy source of information that, if I continue to stay, and I would have to either stay quiet and stop what I was doing, or, I would have to leave as soon as possible. And at that time, it was like actually after the pro-democracy primary election. I was still like helping one of the candidates to run for that election. And then I heard about this, that, I have to make a decision. It was like, I don't think I have like probably 1 week to decide whether or not I need to leave. And it was a lot of pressure, obviously, because my family wanted me to leave. For them, it's not safe for me to stay in Hong Kong, and they know me that I am not going to stay silent. I will probably get in trouble. I don't know, like at that time I still have my student visa, so I left Hong Kong and came to the US, and I didn't want to do this, but my friend convinced me that maybe just go out for a while and observe what's going to happen, and then make your choice. So I did that. I take the opportunity to leave, obviously with the understanding that I would never be able to come back. And then 2 weeks later, I think a week later after I left, Tony Chung was arrested. He was like the youngest student activist that was being arrested under national security law. And then I think 3 months after that, the 47 were arrested. The pro-democracy activists were arrested. And that was the moment I know that, I probably shouldn't go back to Hong Kong. And that's the moment that I announced that I have, left Hong Kong for good and I'm seeking asylum in the US. At that time, I really didn't have much time to think. I just have to go. And that's similar to a lot of people who participated in the 2019 movement. They had probably even less time, like a couple hours to decide whether or not they should leave Hong Kong. So I consider myself lucky and also having that opportunity to come to the US with my student visa and to seek asylum here and actually got asylum very quickly compared to a lot of other people that are still waiting for their asylum. I mean, I think every step of the way, it's hard. I don't want to put up a strong to pretend that everything is fine. I think it's a very tough decision every time. Joining CFHK, taking a step up in in policy advocacy, all of that. I think I sometimes undersell myself on how much courage it has to take to do that and to step up. But it was almost like an instinct. Every time when this opportunity comes up, my thought is this is the right thing to do, so I should do it. I don't know where that come from. I think I have that since I was little. When I saw injustice, I think this is not right and I need to speak up for that. And I think that's a lot of what Hongkonger stands for as well. Whenever I think it was hard, I think about my friends in prison. They have also the opportunity to leave, some of them. They chose to stay. I think of Jimmy Lai, I think of Joshua, I think of many of my friends who decided to stay in Hong Kong when they have the opportunity. I am actually very lucky and I'm using my privilege to speak up for them. And so I take that as part of my responsibility. When I left Hong Kong, I know that this is what I have to this is the burden that I have to carry, is that I'm carrying that privilege to continue to speak up. At that time, I didn't think that my family would be involved. I didn't think that I would get the bounty. I didn't think that my face would be all around Hong Kong streets and become a wanted fugitive. It's really not up to me. It's up to the CCP. If that's the strategy they're taking, I am not going to back down. I think that's, for me, this is not right and I need to speak up. And for Hong Kongers as well, this is for my home. I don't think too much about it.
For those of you who don't know, Frances just alluded to it, but she's got $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty on her head. That's $130,000. You had your passport stripped, your Hong Kong passport stripped, and other problems. She testified in a federal court in Boston against someone who was harassing and stalking her in the 2019 movement. So, then we look and say, I feel like I'm suffering sometimes from PTSD and nothing happened to me, right? But I just had to leave. You had to leave. People had to leave. But I think of, I keep thinking, besides Jimmy, I have 6 other colleagues in Apple Daily who are in jail. And the last call I had, we had an emergency board meeting and a lot of staff were on. The last call we had, right before we left, Chan Pui Man, first and only woman to be the editor-in-chief at Apple Daily, said, "Can you protect us?" And I said, we'll do what we can. And so we just have to do what we can. And I do believe that we will be victorious, but man, it's a long time coming. So, I just think you have to be so grateful about Frances and really understand the sacrifices that she and, so many other people go through. I really want to thank Calvin, Isabel, everybody at JF Books. You guys have a remarkable bookstore and a great community place, and buy some books and support them.